news conference by Secretary General Mark Rutte and U.S. President Donald Trump. We're going to bring that to you live when it begins. Now, here in the studio with me is DW's Chief International Editor, Richard Walker. So we've got a copy of the agreement. Is that correct?
Yep.
And it appears that the president is getting what he's been wanting all these years. More money by other NATO members. Is that correct?
So we've been going through this print. So we've got our highlights here, like looking at the interesting passages. I mean, I guess one thing to say about this is, first of all, this is much shorter than you usually get. Usually at these summits you get a pretty long communique, it's called, and this is kept really small and really tightly focused on this idea of how much NATO countries commit to spending on defence. This has been Donald Trump's complaint going back a decade plus. So when he first ran for president and during his first term, we all remember the kind of clashes that he had at NATO Summit over this feeling that he and many American presidents have had that kind of Europe has been free riding on this on American defence spending, and that the United States has been spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on the biggest defence budget in the world, and year after year the Europeans were spending less despite the growing threat from Russia. So what we have here is a real kind of quantum leap in terms of the levels of defence spending that Europeans are talking about under NATO, and the number is 5% of gross domestic product, so of the economic output of each country, that 5% is the target. And this is a number that Trump started talking about earlier on in his presidency, in his second term.
Let me interrupt you. We're going to go now, Richard, we want to go now live to hear the U.S. president speaking at the NATO Summit.
But we're going to read it to you if you haven't seen it. Have you seen it, Jeff?
Yes, sir.
Have you seen it?
Yes,
okay.
Sir.
Pretty good. Very unfair to the pilots that risk their lives for our country, and then they get fake news, New York Times and CNN, make up a phony story to get some hits. That's the only reason I cared about it, because those pilots were so brave. I've never seen anything like it. They flew into the hornet's nest, and then they got hurt so badly by what the fake news wrote. And it was CNN, it was the New York Times, and they're both disgusting, really horrible groups of people. The pilots did an unbelievable job like nobody's ever seen. They hit pay dirt. You see where I guess you probably look, they call it the wound. You see where the wound is on the earth, and three of them right next to each other. Perfect. And they should be admired and respected for what they did. And the fake news, in order to try and hit me, the fake news made them look bad, but now they look really good again. So that was the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, and it was also about the High Commission of Iran, just said it was totally demolished. But we're going to have a news conference in a couple of minutes, and we'll see you, because I don't want to burden the Prime Minister with this. Okay? Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. I love the Netherlands. Are you from the Netherlands?
Okay, we were just listening to the U.S. president there. Now, the head of NATO, he is speaking, and I think we're going to go take that live. Let's listen in.
The Hague Defence Investment Plan. And this will fuel a quantum leap in our collective defence. They agreed to boost our defence industries, which will not only increase our security, but will also create jobs. And we have reaffirmed our unwavering support for Ukraine. All of this is crucial. It means that no matter the challenges we face, whether from Russia or terrorism, cyber attacks, sabotage or strategic competition, this alliance is and will remain ready, willing and able to defend every inch of Allied territory and ensure that our 1 billion people can continue to live in freedom and security. These decisions will have a profound impact on our ability to do what NATO was founded to do, deter and defend. And the key decision in that regard is to adopt the Hague Defence Investment Plan. With this plan, allies have agreed to invest 5% of GDP in defence. This is a significant commitment in response to significant threats to our security. It includes at least 3.5% of GDP invested in core defence requirements, a benchmark that until today was set at 2%. A target that I'm pleased to say all allies will now meet this year or have already met. The 3.5% is to fund our militaries and the equipment they need, from our air defenses to ammunition, drones, tanks, troops, and more. In addition to the 3.5% for core defense, the plan includes 1.5% of GDP that will go towards investment that support our defense and security. All to ensure we can effectively deter aggression and defend ourselves and each other should anyone make the mistake of attacking. Allies recognize the severity of the threats we face. And in response, they have come together to agree an ambitious but essential new defense spending commitment. Our decisions today show, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic, from the west coast of North America to our eastern flank, all allies are united in understanding that we need to step up to stay safe. And they are acting on it. President Trump has been clear. America is committed to NATO. He affirmed that again today in no uncertain terms. At the same time, he made clear that America expects European allies and Canada to contribute more. And that is exactly what we see them doing. European allies and Canada will do more of the heavy lifting, equalizing their spending and taking greater responsibility for our shared security. Of course, work does not stop here. This is day one. We now shift from agreeing on what we need to rolling up our sleeves and making this new plan a reality. And part of this requires that we rapidly expand our defense industrial capacity on both sides of the Atlantic. We need quality and quantity. We need to innovate and we need to act fast. So we will continue our work to bring down barriers. We will leverage our partnerships with the European Union, with Ukraine, and in the Indo-Pacific to foster defense industrial cooperation. And there are major economic benefits, with the potential for literally millions of extra jobs across the alliance. The decisions made today will make NATO much stronger. They also make NATO a fairer alliance, with Europe and Canada stepping up and carrying their fair share of the responsibility for our shared security. The resolve of allies is clear. We are in this together, committed to Article 5. And we are determined to stand firm. No one should doubt our capacity or determination should our security be challenged. This is the stronger, fairer, and more lethal alliance that NATO leaders have begun to build. Of course, this is also an alliance that stands firmly by our neighbor and partner, Ukraine. My dear friend Volodymyr Zelenskyy is here in The Hague with us at the NATO Summit along with his team. Our resounding message to him and the Ukrainian people is that Ukraine has our continued support, including with over 35 billion euros pledged so far this year, with more to follow. All of this, our aim is to keep Ukraine in the fight today so that it can enjoy a lasting peace in the future. We stand by Ukraine in its pursuit of peace and will continue to support Ukraine on its irreversible path to NATO membership. It has been a momentous meeting today. Leaders have agreed on a trajectory that will ensure we are able to safeguard our freedom and security well into the future. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
All right, I will call on people, and please, if you could state the outlet you're from, if I don't know that already. We'll start with Sky News. Yeah. Right here in the front and the center. We need a mic here. Thank you.
Thank you. Deborah Haynes from Sky News.
Hi.
Hello. The language that you have used when talking to Donald Trump has been notable because of its flattery. Today you called him Daddy, and you sent a text message to him that was gushing with praise. Is this the way that you feel that you have to act when doing business with the US president, through flattery and praise? Isn't it a bit demeaning, and doesn't it make you look weak?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a bit of a question of taste, but I think he's a good friend. And when he is doing stuff which is forcing us to, for example, when it comes to making more investments, I mean, would you ever think that this would be the result of this summit if he would not have been re-elected president? Do you really think that the 7 or 8 countries who said, yeah, somewhere in the 2030s we might meet the 2%, we've now all decided in the last 4 or 5 months to get to 2%? So doesn't he deserve some praise? And when it comes to Iran, the fact that he took this decisive action, very targeted, to make sure that Iran would not be able to get its hands on a nuclear capability, I think he deserves all the praise.
All right. Next question. Let's come to the front here. I think it's BBC.
Yes.
Yes. Well, wait for the mic, please.
Jamal Moussaoui from
Hi.
BBC Persian TV. You said that attack against Iran was illegal and in accordance with the international law. But today, Kaya Kala said she is not sure that it was legal and in accordance with international law. Is there any kind of disagreement between you in NATO?
No, there's not, but there will be many views always about international law. I think what the US did last weekend is justified. This is preventing Iran, and this is a request NATO has had for a long time, a position NATO has taken for a long time, that Iran should not get its hand on a nuclear deterrence. So I think it was totally justified what the US did. And I think it's also important that the American president is very much now working to get the ceasefire not only today and yesterday, but to have that ongoing over the coming weeks.
All right. I see FT in the halfway back.
She has to hold it. Secretary General Henry Foy, Financial Times.
Aye.
The floor. Donald Trump has said the US won't agree with the 5%. That's for all of us to do, but not him. Is that fair in an alliance that's built on sharing and unity? And secondly, what will you do if he comes back next year and asks for more than 5? Thank you.
Well, but when it comes to the 5%, there are the 2 elements. One is the 3.5% core defense spending. The US is more or less there. And when it comes to the 1.5% defense-related spending, we can safely assume that the US is doing that. When you look at their enormous capacity when it comes to fighting cybercrime, hybrid threats, when it comes to their infrastructure investments, when it comes to developing the defense industrial base. So I think we can safely assume that the US is more or less at that 5% already.
All right. Next, I think we'll go over to the left side again, about halfway back, Washington Post. We need a mic.
Thank you, Secretary General Ellen Francis, Washington Post. NATO allies will have to go to great pains to convince people that this money should be spent because of a Russian threat. But some of the comments at this summit suggest that it's all about pleasing President Trump. I think Secretary Rubio called it the Trump Summit. Do you agree that it's the Trump Summit? And how much of this pledge is about keeping the US president happy? Thank you.
Well, there are 2 issues to this and to the 5%. One is that there is this consistent ask from the US. This started already with Eisenhower in the 1950s. For the Europeans and the Canadians to equalize with what the US is spending. And now, finally, we're going to do that. But obviously, the 3.5 core spending and the total 5% is deeply rooted in the outcome of a process in NATO, the NATO defense planning process, which has led to agreeing by the defense ministers 2 weeks ago on our targets. So what each country needs to do when the call would come. If the call would come, we need you to help because there is an Article 5 situation. And we have calculated that to basically reach those targets, we need to spend 3.5% on core defense and, of course, the 1.5% on defense and security-related spending. So there is this US request, please equalize, because it's not fair that we shoulder much more than the others are doing and that we are carrying more weight than the others are doing. And there is the issue of that it is really necessary because of the long-term threat by the Russians to the whole of the Euro-Atlantic area, and also the other upcoming adversaries, and of course the situation with China, where we see this impressive military build-up. So it is both true. The US has consistently had this request now for 60, 70 years, and finally we will do it. And I think that's important. It makes the whole of the alliance more stable and fairer. And there is the need because of Russia and others.
All right. The woman in the third row over on the left side here.
Natalia Robb, the New Voice of Ukraine. Secretary General, you have stated that this year Canadians and Europeans have pledged 35 billion into military support to Ukraine, and this is not even the half of the year. In your opinion, what should be expenditure for Ukraine at the end of the year? And what amount of military aid to Ukraine could help Ukraine to win the war, not just survive?
Well, on the first question, it's difficult for me to exactly predict, but you can safely assume as the trajectory in the first almost 6 months now is really north of the trajectory last year, that also by the end of the year it will end up north of the over 50 billion which was pledged in 2024. So I'm positive about that, optimistic, but I'm not going to make a concrete prediction. But we can safely assume that the end result will be positive. And of course, what we are doing here, we have to make sure that Ukraine can stay in the fight, that Ukraine has what it needs to be as strong as possible. But obviously, we are all also working on getting a peace deal done or a long-term ceasefire done. And then we have to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to prevent Vladimir Putin from ever trying this again in the future. And the first layer of that, making sure that Ukraine can defend itself post a peace deal / a long-term ceasefire, obviously is also the support we are now providing to keep them in the fight, which has to do, of course, with training. It has to do with delivering military equipment, so the command in Wiesbaden, but also the various streams of money going into Ukraine, developing Ukrainians' defense industrial base, which still has about a 35 billion spare capacity. So this all together will help Ukraine to be as strong as possible now, but also to deter the Russians post a peace deal / a ceasefire.
All right, let's come to the center section now. I see CNN in the fourth row.
Thank you so much. I want to follow up on what you just said about the strikes in Iran, but first, can I ask you on Article 5, do you believe that Article 5 is subject to interpretation?
Well, you know, Article 5 is absolutely clear, and at the same time, we have always said we will never go into details when exactly Article 5 will be triggered. And why not? Because we don't want to make our adversaries any wiser.
And to follow up on Iran, sir, you just praised the U.S. strikes in Iran, saying that you do believe it will help prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. There have been questions about where that highly enriched uranium is, and if Iran moved it before the United States struck on Saturday night. Do you have concerns about that and whether or not it poses a threat to NATO?
Look what happened last weekend. American B-2s, nobody in the world is able to do this. Only the United States. You are 25% of the world economy. You are by far the biggest military power in the world. Only the United States is capable to do this. So the B-2s, the fantastic pilots in those fighter jets, the bombs which were used to get deep into these nuclear facilities in Iran. Nobody has that type of stuff. And history made you the leader. History made you the ones who have to take action when it is necessary. And I think what President Trump did here is take a very targeted, chirurgical operation to take out as much as possible Iran's capability to get to a nuclear weapon. And I commend him for that. And obviously it's now up to all the studies being done and all the detailed look into what exactly has been the effect of this. But I'm personally very optimistic that this has dealt a massive blow to Iran.
All right, we have a very full room and limited time. Next question to the front row. There's a mic coming.
Oh, that's good, yeah. Hello, Eelco Bos van Roosendaal, Nieuwsuur, Dutch TV. You're dealing with a very unpredictable president or friend who has been all over the map on Article 5 in the past. In his first term, he threatened to pull out of NATO. which he doesn't seem to do anymore. But how do you know, how are you certain that the Trump you're dealing with right now is the same version of Trump that you'll be dealing with for the rest of his term?
I've now known him for almost 10 years. He's a good friend. I trust him. He was totally right that Europe and Canada were not basically providing to NATO what we should provide, and that the US was spending so much more on defense than the Europeans and the Canadians. Now we are correcting that. We are equalizing. I think it is a man of strength, but also a man of peace. You've seen that basically now with Iran. The man of strength being able to command his B-2 bombers to go into Iran to take out that nuclear capability, but also the man of peace who is then immediately following up with making sure that Israel and Iran will commit to a ceasefire. And I think this is exactly what you want the American president to do, provide that type of leadership. And so I find him very predictable.
Next question, all the way in the back.
I don't think so.
DPA.
Ansgar Hase, German press agency, DPA. Secretary General...
We were speaking.
Here.
There you are. No.
Yeah, in fact.
I cannot see you. I can only answer the question if I see who is. Can you stand up? Oh, you're really in the back. Sorry, yeah. Please.
Thank you. Secretary General, I would like to come back to Article 5. Did President Trump promise in the meeting that he would stand by the allies until the end of his term? And if so, did he promise it without any conditions?
Can I ask you, and not you, you're a journalist, so you're totally, of course, free to ask all those questions, but through you to some politicians in Europe and Canada to stop worrying. The United States is totally committed to NATO. The United States is totally committed to Article 5. How many times do we want them to say this? And as I said before, we have now had half a year when we constantly ask the US, are you with us, with NATO, with Article 5? So let's look for another country in NATO, one of the other 31, Iceland, the Netherlands, France or Canada, for the next half year to answer that question.
All right, limited time, lots and lots of questions. The woman in the green jacket here in the third row.
Kathy Newman, Channel 4 News.
Hi.
Hello. You described in the communique Russia as a long-term threat. Isn't Putin an immediate threat? Did you water that language down to get agreement?
No. Of course, if you're a long-term threat, you're also a short-term threat. So he is a threat now, and he is a threat in the long term.
All right, same row, the woman in the white shirt with the glasses.
Thank you. Ida Hallikainen from Ilta-Sanomat, Finland. Mr. Secretary General, Russia has expanded its military infrastructure near Finland's eastern border. What is Russia aiming to achieve with this, and what is NATO's message on the matter? And second, if I may, is Spain now serious about the defense spending goal?
Yes, on the last question, I believe so. As you know, there is disagreement to disagree that they think they can reach the capability targets by 2.1%. NATO is saying it has to be 3.5%, like for all the other allies. All allies will report on how they are getting to the capability targets, so we will see, and in 2029 we will anyway have a review of all of this. On your first question, well, let's not be naive about Russia. Of course, they are fighting this totally unprovoked war against Ukraine. But at the same time, and this is what we have been hearing, open source from many senior military leaders in Europe, including the Chief of Defense in Germany, they are building up their armed forces and reconstituting their armed forces at such a pace that they could be ready in 3, 5 or 7 years to attack NATO. And that is why today was so important and today is so transformational. Yes, to the question before, because we had to equalize with the US and end the debate which has now been running for 60, 70 years. But particularly also because we know that there is this...
All right, now we want to go to the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. He is speaking at the NATO Summit. Let's listen in.
Der ganz sicher in die Geschichte der NATO eingehen wird, aber es ist auch für uns ein denkwürdiger Tag, denn wir haben diesen NATO-Gipfel wenige Tage bevor wir in Berlin die 70-jährige Mitgliedschaft der Bundesrepublik Deutschland in der NATO begehen werden. 1955, vor 70 Jahren, ist Deutschland der NATO beigetreten.
Unfortunately, our interpreter appears not to be there, so we're going to go to our correspondent, Alexander van Namen. She was there at the press conference listening to the NATO Secretary General. Alexander, let me ask you, I mean, the questions that the reporters were posing there, less emphasis on the fact that the 5% of GDP, that has been agreed to, much more emphasis on whether or not NATO can trust U.S. President Donald Trump.
Yeah, Brand, you're totally right. It was quite interesting to listen to what Mark Rutte had to say, but also to the questions that he faced during his press conference, with many reporters asking him about the language that he used to praise Donald Trump. One journalist asked him whether it was not demeaning to promise Trump a big win here, to say that the Europeans are going to pay big as requested by the U.S. president. Those were the words that Mark Rutte used in a private message to Donald Trump, which was then published by the U.S. president. But I have to say that Mark Rutte handled those questions in a smart way, saying that, of course, it is what it is that Donald Trump can claim credit for the fact that allies now have agreed to massively ramp up their defense spending. But he had to face some critical questions there in the press conference.
And Alexander, there were several questions about whether or not the U.S. president had, in the meeting, had agreed to stand by Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which basically says an attack on one is an attack on all. And his answer was, you know, how many times do we expect the U.S. president to say yes to Article 5? But there is a reason why people keep asking whether or not U.S. President Trump would stand by Article 5, isn't there?
Yes, because one day President Trump says, yes, I am committed to Article 5, to NATO's mutual defense clause, and the other day he may question this principle again. Here in The Hague, he asked about that, said that the U.S. is ready to be with all the allies all the way if needed, and we are hearing that behind closed doors he reaffirmed the U.S. commitment, saying that the U.S. is the greatest ally, and that is what he can guarantee in the next 4 years. But of course, as you said, nobody can guarantee that he is not going to change his mind tomorrow or next week.
Alexander, I just want to ask you one more question. Were you surprised by the fact of how little Russia and Ukraine were mentioned, not only in this press conference, but even in the agreement or the declaration that has been published? I mean, if you think back to the last NATO summit, I mean, it was a big deal. It was omnipresent. Not so this time.
Yeah, it was a big deal. Not this time. That is true. I asked the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, about that. What's the reason for that? And she told me, yeah, you know what? Meaning that now Donald Trump is in office. And this is, of course, related to the way how Donald Trump sees the war in Ukraine, that he has refused so far to acknowledge that it was Russia, that it is Russia to be blamed for invading Ukraine, that he is not a big fan of President Zelenskyy of Ukraine. So all of that is taking into account in this final statement of the summit. But of course, it is very telling that Russia is only mentioned once, not as an aggressor, but as a long-term threat. And that is also due to the fact that the U.S. is still, as they say, trying to bring both sides, Ukraine and Russia, to the negotiating table. But it's also due to the fact that Donald Trump wants to improve the U.S. relationship with Russia, that he is describing the Russian leader as a nice guy. So all of that was reflected here at this summit, in the summit's final declaration.
All right. Alexander, stand by. I want to pull in now Richard Walker, who's here in the studio with me. Richard, if we read through the declaration, what's interesting is that they are going to review this agreement in, 2029. And in 2029, I think President Trump will no longer be U.S. president. Is it possible that what we're seeing at NATO now is just an attempt to satisfy the president, to placate the president as long as he's around, maybe with some members of NATO have their fingers crossed and hidden behind their back?
Well, I think there's an impression that some countries see it that way. But essentially what member states in NATO are kind of juggling here is that this is partly a response to pressure from Donald Trump. And as Mark Rutte, as the Secretary General, has been saying, it's hard to imagine a target like this of 5% having been agreed to at this summit if Trump had not been there. Right. It is extremely difficult to imagine that. So in one sense, NATO members, this is about trying to satisfy Trump, trying to give him a victory, trying to make sure that he even comes to Brussels. I mean, they were to The Hague. That some were worried that he might not even show up. You know, we saw that he left the G7 summit early. So give him the victory in the hope that you keep the Americans with NATO, ideally forever, but for as long as possible, because NATO members are not in a position to defend themselves or stand up to potential intimidation by Russia if the Americans bailed. That's part of it. But the other side of it genuinely is the increased threat perception from Russia. The sense that kind of a collective yikes going on around the continent, which is most intense, kind of closest to Ukraine, and it sort of seeps away the further away you get, but this sense that Europe really does finally have to get serious about its own defence, whether you've got Trump there or not. So these are the two sides of this, but still, I mean, there's an awful lot of fine print here, and we can go into that. Yes. But 5% as this overall big number, and even the 3.5%, which is really the defence spending, and then 1.5% supposed to be on defence-related investment, and that's much fuzzier.
That's softer things.
But it's still quite a milestone, and certainly Donald Trump is a big part of that.
Before we go into the numbers, let me just ask you: are you surprised that in this declaration we see the word Russia one time?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've actually been doing the numbers. I was like, you mentioned this. The last declaration from a NATO summit last year in Washington, D.C., when Joe Biden was still president, there were 43 mentions of Russia. Yeah. This time, one mention of Russia. Yeah. So, and in terms of mentions of Ukraine, the Ukrainians will be happy that Ukraine at least gets mentioned in this document, but there's nothing about it joining NATO in future or something. Last year's Washington Declaration, there were 60 plus
Is there anything we should be reading into that?
Well, I think, as Alexandra said, that part of the reason for that is Trump wants the space to be doing his outreach to Russia. And Trump's argument is, look, I'm trying to build a better relationship with Russia. I don't think we need this antagonistic relationship. I don't think this war needs to continue. I can sort it out. Now, he said he would sort it out in 24 hours. Obviously, kind of like time has moved on since then. But he sees that as an ongoing process. But of course, it does, to an extent, sort of blunt the logic of this huge step up in defense spending that if Russia is barely mentioned in this, then what's the reason for all of this defense spending? So it you know, but still, everyone knows that's the reason. But it certainly, I think, you know, some of the NATO kind of experts have been pointing out that it feels kind of incomplete because of that the whole rationale is not quite expressed.
And the 3.5% commitment, that's for the hardware, that's for the military, that's for the weapons. And then, as you were saying, 1.5%. That actually gives a lot of wiggle room, doesn't it?
Well, the wiggle room goes beyond that. So, okay, almost all the countries have not really argued with this 3.5%, but there's one really notable exception, and that's Spain. Now, you know, we were just talking about the further away you get from Russia, the kind of more kind of chill countries are about their defense. Well, Spain is far from Russia, and I think the last number I saw is 1.28% that it spends of GDP on defense. The new target being like clear defense spending, 3.5% in 10 years. So, I mean, there's time to get there. The Spanish Prime Minister, in the days leading up to this summit, was saying, nope, I'm not going to do 3.5%. I can achieve what you want us to achieve with 2.1%. With 2.1%. Now, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, said yesterday, or was it the day before, saying, they say 2.1%. I think they're going to have to spend 3.5% to get there. And and kind of hoping, like, let's leave it like that. And if you look at the language of the declaration, it says allies commit to invest.
But it doesn't say all allies.
All allies. It says allies. And notably, of course, it doesn't include the US either. I mean,
Right.
Trump is saying, he's saying, we're not going to do the 5%. Now, of course, Trump, as we heard from Mark Rutte, the Americans do spend roughly 3.5% of their GDP on defense. And Mark Rutte sort of said, I'm sure if you totted up the other stuff, you would get to the 1.5 of the other stuff. But still, so there's, Spain has been a bit of a special case. It's been quite public in its objections. This is one thing I'm going to be looking out for in the Trump press conference, because it was interesting. There was no questions that we heard while we were listening into Rutte on that. Do people really try to throw this in Trump's face? Like, what about Spain? Because if they do, you know, who knows how he's going to respond to that? Is he going to be relaxed about it and say, you know, go along with the fudge? Or could this kind of trigger, you know,
he's known for not being a detail-oriented president. He could maybe just say, I'm leaving that to other people to deal with.
Yeah, but, I mean, Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, was asked about this. I think it was Politico had an interview with him leading into this, and he said it's a problem. It's a big problem, you know? So it's kind of up to the Americans whether they make a show out of it or not. But, of course, with Donald Trump, you never know, and this is why everyone's been a bit on edge leading into this.
And this agreement says the goal is to reach this 5% by 2035. That's 10 years from now.
It's a long time. And as you mentioned, so there's going to be a review in 2029.
Yeah.
So this is also what Mark Rutte said about Spain. We'll see how they're doing in 2029. But yeah, it looks like the Americans have gone along with this. You also have to be a bit realistic. You cannot kind of go from spending, you know, below 2% to 3.5%. It doesn't, okay, if you hear those numbers, it doesn't sound like a huge difference.
But it's a lot. It is a lot.
You know, in a country, especially like Germany, this is tens and tens of billions of euros.
Right.
You can't suddenly click your fingers and you've got another 10, 20,000 soldiers. You can't click your fingers, suddenly you have, like,
You're
more
not in
warships,
Kansas
you have
anymore.
more fighter jets and stuff. It takes time, you know. It's hard to spend that much money in one go. So it's a journey. But if we think back, like the last time a target like this was set was in the UK and Wales in 2014. That was when they set this famous 2% target. It took years. They don't even all spend that now, you know, despite everything that's happened since then. So I mean, this is like Rutte said, this is the beginning of the road. You know, now it's going to be all about kind of following up on this and seeing whether countries, and all of these countries all have their own domestic spending problems, their own political issues, whether they can really sustain this.
And Rutte has also described NATO as being like a big oil tanker. I mean, it's slow to move it in either direction, but when it does move, you know it. So by 2035, in 10 years from now, will the security situation that NATO is dealing with, will it even look like anything that we know today? I mean, there's a lot of assumptions here, and there's a lot of guessing as well.
Yeah, I mean, and inevitably there is. But I think there's a strong sense that, you know, NATO countries, since the end of the Cold War, they've assumed that the best of worlds is going to emerge. And now we're in a world where you have to assume that the worst case scenario could come. There have been so many incidences of that recently. And that's basically what you're hearing. We just heard from Rutte. They're having to kind of prepare for the scenario that the Russians and he said sort of 3, 5 or 7 years are potentially going to be in a position with their own defense ramp up, that they might want to attack a NATO member state in some form. And this would maybe most likely to be one of the Baltic states, which are the most vulnerable. They're former, members of the Soviet Union, gained their independence after that. They're hard to defend for the rest of NATO. That's the big fear. And the fear that NATO planners have is that it could be kind of coming at the alliance very soon. So that's the reason for this urgent ramp up, as well as the pressure coming from Trump.
Let me ask you about the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte. You know, we've sat here many times talking about NATO summits and NATO policy. And if we think back to when Jens Stoltenberg was head of NATO, can you imagine Jens Stoltenberg being so emotive with his compliments, the way that we saw today with Mark Rutte? I mean, it is remarkable, isn't it?
I mean, Stoltenberg was a cool customer. I mean, you wouldn't have got this kind of language out of Rutte. I think this is how Rutte is interpreting, he's like thinking, this is what you pay me for. You know, you've made me NATO Secretary General. We've got this new president coming in who has a history of this antipathy towards NATO. My main job is to make sure that he stays on board, that he comes to this summit, he feels happy, he feels, you know, we saw what just happened at G7. He kind of walked away early. He, you know, obviously discussions about why that was. They couldn't afford this to happen. I can tell you from briefings on the German side, they were very, very nervous about, let's just get through this NATO summit, make sure it goes okay, there's no blow up. We get our, you know, the spending agreement. That's what he gets, is the spending agreement. Basically, what the NATO countries get is a real kind of express black and white confirmation that the whole of NATO stands by Article 5, which is in there in this declaration. And Rutte, I think everything that we're seeing from him, this obsequiousness, is all serving that purpose. Now, you can debate about whether it's smart and whether he's going overboard and whether it is making Trump feel potentially totally complacent about the position of NATO. And I think one of the early tests, or the next kind of bump in the road or decision point, is the Americans are conducting a review of their military posture around the world, which is, we've heard that, you know, we're expecting a decision in late summer or early into the fall. The Americans might decide we need to reallocate some troops, pull some troops out of Europe, send them into Asia. The team who are conducting that review in the Pentagon are known to be, you know, they are individuals who are very focused on the threat of China. They think that the United States has been way too deep in European defense, kind of looking after all of these pampered, wealthy Europeans who can pay for their own defense. Thank you very much. So that's the next thing. Like, do the Americans decide to move a significant number of troops out of Europe? And that would only add to the impression that, you know, this increase in defense spending in Europe is absolutely essential. But of course, the flip side of that is that, you know, it's that kind of increase in defense spending that opens the way for the Americans to move those troops away.
Richard Walker, thank you very much. You've been watching DW News special coverage of the NATO Summit. I'll be back at the top of the hour with more world news. Hope to see you then.